From the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, I'm Carla Gonzalez, and this is From the South. The president of Bolivia, Evo Morales, has officially been re-elected to office with 47.07% of the vote. Thousands of people rallied across Bolivia to celebrate Evo's latest victory. The results were made official on Thursday by the Supreme Electoral Tribunal. The closest runner-up opposition candidate and former President Carlos Mesa obtained 36.51% of the vote. As Morales managed to finish the race over 10 points ahead of his rival, there is no need for a runoff vote in accordance with the Constitution. During an interview on Thursday night, President Morales hailed the role played by Bolivia's indigenous people in awarding him a new victory.
In colonial times, we were threatened with extermination. In times of the Republic, we were discriminated against, subjected to a certain domination. The indigenous movement is a historical asset. And where does our strength come from? From this very movement, from our peasants. That's where we started our political instrument. And now, when the elections came once again last Sunday, October 20th, we were told there's going to be a second round. We're losers. But I said in the evening, the votes are still coming from the indigenous regions. How could we ignore that, as in the past, and repeat history, diminish the vote from the indigenous movement? I mean, I thank all the votes from the city. They serve me. But the indigenous movement vote arrived, and that's when we won by more than 10%.
But despite Morales' clear victory and the transparency with which the vote counting was carried out, opposition leader Carlos Mesa said Morales consummated fraud and has called on his supporters to continue taking to the streets. Violent opposition groups have been active since Sunday, setting fires to a number of regional buildings from the Supreme Electoral Court and from the ruling party. The Foreign Minister of Bolivia, Diego Pari, traveled to the United States on Thursday to attend a meeting of the Organization of American States, which has supported the claims of opposition groups in Bolivia and has insisted that the country hold a runoff vote. Our correspondent Jorge Gestoso spoke with the Foreign Minister during his visit to Washington, and here's what he had to say.
En realidad, las elecciones los ha ganado el presidente Morales.
The reality is that elections have been won by President Evo Morales. There is a clear result. The Bolivian constitution establishes two ways for a candidate to be elected president. One is that they obtain 50% of all votes cast, or they must obtain over 40%, with a more than 10-point difference between the first and second place candidates. The different political actors, the candidates, can recognize the result of the audit. However, there is one clear element, the constitutional instance which defines the percentage, which defines the results, which communicates the results of the elections in Bolivia, is the Supreme Electoral Tribunal. If auditors come to accompany the Supreme Electoral Tribunal, it is to verify that the actors have been counted correctly. Well, we want to thank the countries which have made pronouncements today. Suriname, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Mexico, Nicaragua, countries that demonstrated that we must exercise our sovereignty. Countries which, if we are part of an international organization, we must respect issues which are internal. The matters which are internal to states. In that opportunity, we have solicited the Permanent Council. We have solicited it to tell the OAS, to the member states, to the states which have any doubts regarding our electoral process, that we have developed an electoral process which is transparent, a process which is verifiable, and each of the votes and acts can be verified in a public manner. So we have invited the countries of the OAS, the international organizations, if there are doubts about our process, go to Bolivia. Verify the voting records, one by one, if it's necessary. We have asked that they present evidence. It's an electoral process which is completely transparent. The information is verifiable. In the case of Bolivia, there exists no margin for a fraud to be carried out or for voting records to be modified. Why is that? Each voting record completed, each voting record from every voting table where up to 300 people can cast their vote includes the signature, the digital fingerprint of the delegates of the political parties. Every political party has a delegate and can have up to 2 delegates in every voting table. And those voting records, at the time they are being counted, which is a public count, the records are filled out and the signature and the digital fingerprint. That information is sealed in an envelope and sent to the Supreme Electoral Court. And in addition, every one of the delegates takes with them another copy of the voting record. And now with technology, the delegates also take their own picture.
For more on Bolivia, we were joined by Senior Research Fellow at the Center for Economic and Policy Research and the former Foreign Minister of Ecuador, Guillaume Long. He spoke to us about the opposition's claims of fraud.
So at the center, we've been following the Bolivian elections closely, and I have to say that we're very concerned about this kind of, I would call a framing, the growing framing in the international press, which is actually encouraging the Bolivian opposition to follow this narrative of a fraudulent election. We have seen no evidence of fraud. We followed the tendency very carefully. We followed the vote count very carefully. And so far, everything that the mathematicians have been predicting has been happening, looking at the different actas from the different regions. We've double checked on the quick vote, on the slow count, on the quick count, sorry, on the slow count, and everything seems to match. So I think it's dangerous and it's unwarranted and it's maybe even politically motivated that we're seeing this narrative around potentially fraudulent elections in Bolivia, when what we should all be doing, including the Bolivian election and certainly the international news corporations, we should be waiting for the results to be issued. Right now, we're on 99.1% of the total counts the last time I looked. And we do right now have a 10.4% lead in favor of Evo Morales. I've seen some of the news coverage saying that it's a tight race. It's a tight race in terms of whether there is a 10% margin in favor of the candidate, Evo Morales. It's not a tight race between the first and the second candidate. So there's been a lot of disinformation there. Just to remind our audience that Evo Morales to be elected needs either 50% plus 1 of the votes or 40% and a 10-point margin. And so far, with 99.1% of the vote counted, he has got that 10% margin. But I've been very surprised by the OAS's behavior during the Bolivian elections. First, they issued a press release on Monday, which is not the kind of thing that the OAS electoral missions do, unless there's a real massive problem, as there was in the Honduran elections. I myself have been a member of OAS electoral missions. I have actually been the head of an OAS mission in Bolivia, so I know the system quite well. And, you know, the OAS's press release was none of the things they've said have been very technical. Usually the OAS is very technical in the details that they give, you know, the kinds of things that they've observed. These press releases have been very political, and then you saw a backtrack on the following day, which sort of hints at the possibility that there's some divisions inside the OAS, because the second press release said the reverse of the first one. And then the preliminary report, which was issued yesterday, essentially calls for a second round, for a runoff, without giving any evidence of irregularity. The only vague irregularity it mentions is that the state may have participated in the campaign, but then the OAS usually complains that Latin American states, governments, if you like, participate in campaigns too much, and they always have that in their reports, and it's never been a reason for discarding or not validating the electoral results in Latin America. So suddenly they're using this, which is a change in the argument. It's a hurried report. It's a 5-page report when the reports are usually much longer. And now it's been elevated even before the final vote count to the Permanent Council of the OAS in Washington and is being discussed by the ambassadors there. So it's a very political response on behalf of the OAS, and its electoral missions are usually very technical. So it's made us at the center here very suspicious about what the real motivations are behind the OAS's behavior.
Coming up, protesters in Chile denounce abuse and torture by the police. Don't go away.
A review of the world news that investigates, incites analysis, and induces criticism, because every event has a context.
Pusimos el punto en la I.
Dot in the eye. Saturdays, only on Telesur.
The life is full of moments. Moments of fight. Moments of hope. Moments that transcend. Moments that you can live in. Telesur documentaries. Sundays. Only on Telesur.
Welcome back. During the closing campaign rally of the Frente de Todos party in Argentina, presidential candidate Alberto Fernandez once again questioned the neoliberal policies applied by President Mauricio Macri.
We have had 4 years of worries in Argentina. We have seen the closure of 43 companies per day. Between retirees or the banks, we choose the retirees. Between public education or the banks, we choose public education. Between public health or the banks, we choose public health. And between the workers or the banks, we choose the workers.
And the vice presidential candidate Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner stressed the importance of the upcoming vote on October 27th.
This is not just an event to say empty words so that you vote for us. We are not that. We are here as part of the Frente de Todos because we are men and women who have convictions. We are closing a historic cycle for a country that will never again fall into the hands of neoliberalism. We want to avoid more pain for Argentinians. That's why we are together today, to say never again to these policies. Never again.
Meanwhile, during the closing rally of the Juntos por el Cambio party, President Mauricio Macri insisted that voting for him is voting for a better country.
Por eso hoy les quiero preguntar.
Today, I want to ask you, and I want to hear you answer loud and clear, so that the entire country can hear. Do we want to vote for honesty? Do we want to confront criminal gangs and drug trafficking? Do we want an independent justice system? Do we want to say no to impunity? Of course we do. And it's because we do that we'll vote together on Sunday.
Between December of 2015 and the second quarter of 2019, Argentina's external debt increased by $113 billion. Under the rule of President Macri, Argentina's debt with the International Monetary Fund has increased as well, currently standing at 93% of the country's gross domestic product.
2 years after an exhaustive process of debt relief during the Kirchner's administration, Mauricio Macri's government signed a new loan from the IMF to the amount of $50 billion and extended it afterwards to $57 billion more. This is the highest amount the IMF has ever loaned to a country.
The main reason to impose political and economic measures on the people, back in Argentina's history, the external debt increased enormously during the military dictatorship, where there was a genocide. All governments have tried to pay that huge debt since then. So this debt has an illegitimate and deceitful background. It was made only to put the country under the control of multinational corporations and banks.
And once again, the IMF puts conditions on Argentina's policies.
They will demand more labor flexibility, new labor reforms to lower working conditions, making labor force cheaper in order to benefit multinational corporations. They will also ask for a pension reform that would allow them to increase the age of retirement. And of course, they will continue making business using public funds with the big banks, with the big economic groups, with Donald Trump's investment funds, with the European Union, with the IMF and the World Bank.
From the $44 billion dispersed by the IMF, 30 billion will be used to finance capital outflows, despite such an act being prohibited by the IMF's rules.
The external debt should not be seen from one point of view only. It actually has two phases. On one phase, there's the debt contraction, which is common here in Latin America. On the other hand, there is the immediate outflow of capital. Many times that debt is only there to finance the outflow, and then the time comes when the people demand those outflows to be paid back.
According to Néstor Ferreira, the government put up the country's natural resources and state-owned companies as a guarantee for the loan.
During the second day of a general strike in Chile, in the midst of massive anti-government protesters, social movements called on people to hold community assemblies or cabildos to discuss the future of the country. Assemblies like this are intended as a step towards a constituent assembly to bring sweeping changes to Chile's political system. They are being held at universities, in communities and on the streets as protesters again gather in the center of Santiago and across the country. The lower house of Chile's Congress has voted in favor of reducing the work week to 40 hours. The proposal still has to pass through committees and the Senate. It's one of several initiatives by President Sebastián Piñera in the wake of the protests. But they seem to have little impact on the protesters, who say it's too little too late.
I have signed and sent to Congress today a law project that creates a mechanism to stabilize energy prices. Tomorrow I will sign and send to Congress a draft legislation that allows an increase in pensions, which will favor almost 3 million pensioners.
The official number of people killed in the last week of protests in Chile remains at 15, although the Doctors Association puts the number at 23, while over 5,000 have been arrested. A lawyer for the University of Chile says this is the worst repression since the Pinochet dictatorship.
The information we're getting from doctors and health centers is that this kind of situation hasn't been seen since the dictatorship. The doctors say there has never been such a large number of people arrested or so much violence against them since the military dictatorship.
And hundreds of protesters gather outside a police station in the neighborhood of Peñalolén to denounce torture. They say a protester called Vivona was brought here and was subjected to horrendous abuse. Human rights organizations say at least 30 of those arrested have been tortured. On Wednesday, an alleged torture center was discovered in one of Santiago's subway stations. After this last break, anti-government protests resume in Iraq and police fire live ammunition to contain them. Stay with us.
We are present at every event where our nations are staring. We believe in a new global vision, united in every broadcasting. We keep expanding our horizons and working on a closer and better communication. Now, in Grenada, Telesur, the news source from South America and the Caribbean.
acompañamos a los pueblos que resisten en cada una de sus luchas.
Somos esa ventana que se abre para visibilizarlos entre fronteras.
Thursdays, only on Telesur.
Welcome back. Botswana's President Mokgweetsi Masisi has been re-elected after his party secured 51% of seats in parliament. This comes after Wednesday's general elections, as the constitution stipulates the leader of the party with the most seats in parliament becomes president. Masisi first became president in 2018 after his predecessor Ian Khama resigned. Since then, the two had a falling out, with Khama in turn supporting the opposition. Botswana's Democratic Party has been in power since the country gained independence from Britain in 1966. In Zimbabwe, the government has called for a march to demand the lifting of sanctions imposed by the United States and the European Union. The authorities have also declared Friday a public holiday and dispatched hundreds of buses across the country to ferry people to Harare. According to the government, these sanctions are illegal and stem from the US and EU unfairly taking sides in a diplomatic dispute between Zimbabwe and the United Kingdom concerning the takeover of white-owned farms. Police in Burundi have arrested 4 journalists who covered clashes between the country's military and rebels from the neighboring Democratic Republic of Congo. The 4 were arrested alongside the driver as they attempted to interview civilians fleeing from the war zone. A senior police officer confirmed the detention of the journalists but could not state the reason for their arrest. Meanwhile, an organization representing the journalists claims the arrest is an attempt to conceal atrocities committed by the military against civilians.
As for your fellow journalists from the Iwacu newspaper, they are in Bubanza, at the Bubanza police station. Investigations will be carried out, and you know very well that such preliminary and judicial investigations are discreet investigations, and we will wait for the end of the investigations and for the appropriate time. If their alleged acts are not proven, they will be released, and, if not, they will be transferred to the competent authorities of the Public Prosecutor's Office.
Hundreds of Algerian lawyers marched in the capital Algiers to call for the reform of the justice system. They also demanded an end to the so-called telephone justice, which sees arrests and trials carried out without any evidence. According to a committee that defends detainees, just last week a journalist was detained on charges of undermining the morale of the army. Algeria has been rocked by weekly mass protests since February that led to the ousting of President Abdelaziz Bouteflika and forced authorities to detain many senior officials on corruption charges.
Today we demand the independence of the Justice Authority. The Justice Authority must be independent. We have to get rid of telephone justice. We have to get rid of revenge justice. And to build a country of law, we need a strong and independent justice system.
Police in Iraq have used live ammunition to disperse thousands of protesters in Baghdad as anti-government demonstrations resumed after 3 weeks. According to reports, at least 1 person has been killed and several were injured. Demonstrators are calling on the government to address high unemployment rates, poor public services and corruption. Around 150 people were killed by security forces in a confrontation at the start of the month. China has condemned a recent speech by U.S. Vice President Mike Pence in which he accused the Asian giant of curtailing rights and liberties in Hong Kong. A spokesperson for the Chinese Foreign Ministry said that Pence's comments were full of lies and prejudice, adding that the U.S. better look at their own domestic problems.
Pence's speech was exactly the same as the one he made last October, revealing pure arrogancy and hypocrisy, and it was filled with political bias and lies. China expresses strong indignation and a firm opposition. We suggest that some people in the U.S. look in the mirror and recognize their own problems, manage their own affairs, don't go about making irresponsible remarks everywhere, and stop playing dirty tricks that harm others and aren't beneficial to their own selves.
And with that, we end our news brief. But remember, you can find all of our stories by checking our website, telesurenglish.net. And you can also join us on social media. We're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For Telesur English, I'm Carla Gonzalez. Thank you for watching.
A review of the world news that investigates, incites analysis, and induces criticism, because every event has a context.
Pusimos el punto en la I.
Dot in the eye. Saturdays. Only on Telesur.
Discover the cultural diversity that defines a continent. The place where art and tradition are part of the same nucleus. Artistic explorations, values,